Hello, and greetings, Christ the King. Today we start a new series for catechesis, a series that I'm calling Our Anglican Heritage, in which we'll trace the history of the Anglican Church. This is obviously a very big topic, and so we're going to break it down into at least three sub-series. So first, the ancient history of the Anglican Church. Second, the Reformation, and third, more modern events. And through all of this, we want to keep focused on a few key questions. First, where did the Anglican Church come from? And how did it develop over time? Second, we want to find out what are some of the unique features or characteristics of Anglican Christianity. And third, how can our worship and devotion be enriched by our Anglican heritage? So these are the things that we'll want to keep in the back of our mind and discuss on the Zoom calls. But we'll start this series with the first part, which will cover the ancient streams of Anglicanism. And so for this and the next two videos, we will look at what I've identified as the three most important ancient streams of Anglicanism. And those are Celtic Christianity, English or Anglo-Saxon Christianity, and then Benedictine spirituality. So for today, Celtic Christianity. All right, so going all the way back to the beginning and the origins of Christianity in Britain, it was, of course, the Romans who introduced Christianity to the British Isles. Now, the Romans, you'll recall, had invaded the British Isles, arriving there in 43 AD. But they were not the first people in the British Isles. The first significant group of people living in Britain that we should know were, in fact, the Celts. So the Celts were a group of people who arrived in Britain roughly 400 BC. They were known as Britons. Today we would call them the Cornish, the Welsh, and the Irish. Other Celts were in France, in Gaul, and other places in Europe. So these were a big tribe of so-called barbarians that migrated throughout Europe. And a lot of these Celts made it to the British Isles roughly 400 BC. So when the Romans show up around 43 AD, they fight the Celts. And in order to keep out the Celts from what's today southern England, they build a wall, Hadrian's Wall. You can see it on the map on the slide. And the Romans built this in order to keep out the northern Celtic tribes that we would call the Picts and the Scots. And presumably these Romans would have included the first Christians who had come from the continent, bringing their faith with them as part of this Roman army. Now, legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea, who gave the tomb where Jesus was buried, legend has it that he was the first to bring Christianity to the British Isles. It's certainly possible, but historically speaking, we're on the firmest ground when we point out that it was probably these Roman soldiers and merchants who were the first ones to bring Christianity to Great Britain, at least in a meaningful way. And historically, we can see the importance of British Christianity early on by the fact that a synod in the year 314, a gathering of bishops from across Western Europe, actually attracted 3 bishops from Britain. So the faith was clearly established in Britain by 314. Okay, so we have all these Roman Christians in Britain, but how do the Celtic peoples turn to Christianity? And to make a long story short, the answer is St. Patrick. So St. Patrick we've all heard of, St. Paddy's Day. Okay. Unfortunately, today he's mostly celebrated by people drinking copious quantities of green alcohol. But that's not really at all what St. Patrick was about. In fact, Patrick is really an exemplary model of missions in the early church. So Patrick was a Roman Briton, and he was captured by the Irish and then taken in Ireland as a slave. He would later escape from slavery. But what's fascinating is that he wants to go back and bring his captives to the Christian faith. So he's ordained a missionary bishop to the Celts, and he ends up having enormous success in bringing Christianity to the Celtic people of Ireland. In Anglican worship today, we probably know him best for authoring the prayer that's at the basis of our baptismal hymn, "I bind unto myself today." Sometimes you'll see this prayer printed as the breastplate of St. Patrick. Very distinctly Irish or Celtic in its approach. A lot of language about nature and creation. It's a very earthy. Yeah, look at the lyrics. It's very distinctively Celtic, I would say.
Hey, Dan.
Now, in turn, the Celts themselves would send out missionaries quite great distances. So Celtic missionaries would found monasteries, and then from these monasteries, they would be sent out to convert nearby countries. What's interesting is that it's the heads of the monasteries and not the bishops that have most of the power in the early Celtic church. So in the Roman church, for instance, there's a much more explicit hierarchy that develops. But here in the early Celtic church, it's the monastic communities and the leaders of those communities that really hold the power for Celtic Christianity. So a couple of the most famous Celtic missionaries, St. Columba, founded a monastery on the island of Iona in 563, and it was this monastery that would go on to evangelize Scotland and then the Anglo-Saxon peoples of the British Isles after those invasions. We'll talk about that next time. Also, St. Columbanus took a group of 12 disciples to mainland Europe, where he evangelized the Germanic peoples there. And what's so important about the Irish here is that unlike most of the rest of Western Europe, which was invaded by Germanic peoples in the 400s and 500s, Ireland was spared those invasions. And so the manuscripts that were being copied and preserved survived in Irish monasteries that were destroyed almost everywhere else in Western Europe. So one historian has written a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization that effectively argues that it was the Irish Christian monasteries that managed to preserve for us the legacy of the Greco-Roman world. And were it not for them, much of our knowledge of antiquity would have been lost. So let's think about some of the distinctive forms of Celtic spirituality. We can think about how they connect to the present day. So number one, they were unique at the time for making private confessions to priests. That, of course, becomes part of the Catholic tradition and within a lot of Anglicanism as well. Well, that practice really began in a significant way within the Celtic Church. Second, in the Celtic Church, we saw that women had similar rights as men and even held leadership positions in the church itself. So this is, of course, very different from the rest of the trajectory of Western Christianity, and Eastern for that part. So it's a bit of an outlier, but it is very interesting. And there's a number of very interesting female Celtic saints at this time, like St. Bridget. Number three, the Celts had a very positive view of the natural world. They had a sense of wonder and awe, believing that the divine resided in everything. I point you back again to I bind St. Patrick's breastplate, that prayer and that baptismal hymn. So they're really into nature. And I think it's for that reason that we see a lot of the stories of the Irish saints. They have animal companions that are with them. So really into animals and nature. Fourth, they had a very positive view of learning. They believed that all truth was God's truth. And that's why they were so diligent in preserving ancient manuscripts, even those that were not Christian. And they were known for their illustrations of manuscripts. So these pictures here are from the Book of Kells, one of the most important and beautifully illuminated manuscripts to survive from the Celtic Church, and really any church. Next, the Celts had a very positive view of travel and exploration. So we get a number of stories of Celtic saints who have these fantastical voyages over sea and over land. And there ends up being the special term for some of these folks. They're known as white martyrs. So whereas a red martyr is someone who shed blood and died for the faith, a white martyr doesn't physically die, but a white martyr is one who left their home to travel to a distant land as a missionary. So we think about the missionary impulse today, and within the Anglican communion today, and looking back at the Celts, this was pretty unique for the time. Most of Christendom didn't see missions as a significant thing, and so what the Irish are doing here is very important, I think. Next, they had a love of silence and solitude. So in their monasteries, they would strictly observe times of quiet. And in fact, they would have entirely separate places where monks and nuns could go off when they needed to be alone. So these foundational disciplines of Celtic and I'd say Anglican spirituality, silence and solitude, still very important for us today. And then they emphasize time as a sacred reality, the importance of living in the present. And obviously as Anglicans, we think a lot about time, how we engage with sacred time, how we aim to bring God into the rhythms of our daily life. And again, I think all of these things, in large part, go back to the Celtic influence on Anglicanism. Because along with that, the Celts really appreciated what we might call the ordinary life. Because they focused so much on the present, they could really appreciate the daily, the routine, and the ordinary. And they went about their days with an attitude of gratitude, worshiping God not in spite of, but in fact through their daily work and ordinary chores. So we have all these wonderful prayers from the early Celtic Church. For instance, the blessing of the kindling. I will kindle my fire this morning in the presence of the holy angels of heaven, without malice, without jealousy, without envy, without fear, without terror of anyone under the sun, but the Holy Son of God to shield me. God, kindle thou my heart within, a flame of love to my neighbor, to my foe, to my friend, to my kindred all, to the brave, to the knave, to the thrall. And so even something as simple as lighting the kindling for the morning becomes the basis for a liturgy, for prayer. And recently, you might have seen that there, in the packets we got at CTK for the Advent wreaths, there is a prayer you can pray, a blessing of the Advent wreath. And I thought to myself, this sounds a lot like a very Celtic kind of idea. Finally, the Celts really valued interpersonal relationships. So they believed that inner healing only happens when you're vulnerable with other people. And they really found it important that you have a lifelong, what they would call soul friend, or anam cara. So someone that your soul connects with. And the Celts would say someone without a soul friend is like a body without a head. So again, this emphasis on authentic community and relationships, again, I see passing from the Celts even into our present day. So for our Zoom discussion, I want us to talk about this question. Which aspects of Celtic spirituality do you find most intriguing, and why? And if you're interested at all in this topic, I've given you some resources here that you can check out to learn more about the Celts and think about how they contributed to the Anglican way.